It's your girl, your host, Jocelyn, and I'm so grateful you all are here. And I'm so grateful to be joined by Jen Casey, who is a brain-based business coach, speaker, energy healer, and host of the Top 100 Psyche podcast. Hello, Jen Casey.
Hello, it's so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into this conversation. We are actually having our first conversation ever. So we are just getting to know each other. I don't remember exactly how I came across you. Probably was through your podcast, which I enjoy, by the way. It's so good. I love how you hold space for the spiritual journey, but also the professional journey and how those two mend. So I'm excited to tap deeper into that with your own journey. Let's go ahead and start by you sharing with us what it is that you currently feel grateful for.
So I love that you begin every episode just really using this as a jumping off point. And I was really thinking about this, and the one word that I kept coming back to over the last couple of weeks was sisterhood. And it's as true today as it was then, that truly having a very beautiful, supportive sisterhood. It's not something that I've always had. I've had a lot of mean girls in my life and, different toxic relationships. And today to be in a place where I have such supportive, expansive women in my life, it's such a mirror for me of all the healing that I've done around being able to be supported and received as myself. And so I'm very grateful to the sisterhood of beautiful spiritual women that I have in my life.
Yeah. And I'm excited that you mentioned that as your gratitude, because that's something that I want to expand on in our conversation. And we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. But sisterhood has actually been on my mind a lot too. So I'm excited to exchange our thoughts and experiences on that topic. But I'd like to start by asking you, when I went to your website, and you have this really beautiful breakdown of how you came to be the successful 7-figure entrepreneur that you are today. But I'd like to know the spiritual journey behind that, the breakdown behind that. So walk us through the conscious beginning of your spiritual journey. And I say conscious beginning because if I were to simply say walk us through the beginning of your spiritual journey, I believe that our whole life journey is spiritual.
It really is.
There's a certain point where we awaken to that truth. So walk us through that.
Okay. So, I love how you frame this, because definitely as a kid, I had conscious awareness. I was unfiltered, bossy, said whatever I thought. I slapped a teacher across the face at 2.5 years old. And when my mom asked me why I did that, I said, because she's a phony. And I meant it and I understood that. So I always was very receptive to people's energies. But, like so many of us who have energy abilities and spiritual gifts, life happened. And it wasn't until probably 2011 when I just graduated college with a degree in psychology, decided not to pursue a PhD path at that time, and really wanted to go all in with my acting and performing career, and simultaneously began working in an online business in network marketing. And that was a big catalyst for many reasons. One, because in that network marketing space, they really encouraged reading personal development. So that was the first moment of, wait a minute, I can change my thoughts. Wait a minute, I could have more. Wait a minute, I could feel good. I didn't even know that was a possibility in the early days. I kind of figured, oh, you just have confidence or you don't, or you just feel comfortable or you don't. And I didn't really see that there was a permission slip for greater levels of expansion. So that was really the beginning. And around that time, it's so funny to look back now, because I woke up randomly on a Sunday, still living with my parents. This might actually have been a little bit before 2011. And Oprah's Super Soul Sunday was on. And I sat down in front of the TV, and the author of The Four Agreements, Don Miguel Ruiz, was on. And I just remember sitting there inches away from the TV, which was not something that I did. You know, as a little kid, I was like in my 20s at the time. And I'm staring at the TV, and this man just looked so childlike, so angelic, so light. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know what he's smoking. I don't know what he's drinking. Like, I don't know what he's doing, but I need some of that in my life. I want to feel the way that he appears to feel. And I bought that book, and that was pretty much my Bible through auditions. And anytime I was stressed, that was really a huge catalyst for me actually having something, some tool to lean on to quiet my very busy, very negative style of thinking at that time. So that was really like the beginning.
I love Don Miguel Ruiz. Like,
I
he's
love him.
hands down one of my favorite authors. Like, his books are my favorite of his books are is The Mastery of Love. It's like my Bible.
Like, I've got them
It's
all.
they're so good, and I love how the way that he expresses what could be such difficult to grasp spiritual concepts are so digestible. Like, he doesn't make them more complicated than they need to be.
Yeah.
I feel like in the beginning of our spiritual journeys, like more often than not, it begins with a lot of shadow work. Like, we start realizing more so who it is that we're not than who it is that we truly are. So there's like a lot of shedding taking place. Was that true for you in your case?
Yes, 100%. And actually bringing this back to all of the amazing books that he's written, one of my favorites was The Voice of Knowledge, because there was one quote in it that still rings in my ears today. And I remember reading it, and it just hit me in the gut, in the face, between the eyes. It hit me everywhere. And it was the voice of knowledge is about the voice that's in your head. And he says, if you're the one who's listening, who's doing the talking? If you're the one who's listening, who's doing the talking? And that was such a like, oh shit kind of moment for me. Who is doing the talking? Who is this voice? And I didn't know anything about spirits or, even, the program. I had no idea. I'd never even thought about it. I knew there was a voice in my head. I knew it was annoying, but I never saw the duality of that until that moment. And that was a life-changing moment. And so speaking to this question around, shadow work and figuring out who we're not, that was the first time where I was able to say, okay, I'm the listener. So this is not all my voice. This doesn't feel good. And if it doesn't feel good, then this is not my higher self. So where did these voices come from? Where does this programming come from? And I was able to finally have that moment to pause and separate out. And I think it was The Power of Now. I remember reading that, and he says, when your mind is really busy, you want to pause and think to yourself, let me wait for the next thought. And then when you do that, it actually becomes really quiet, at least for a little bit, because you're like, okay, what's the next thought? I'm waiting for the next thought. And then maybe that's the thoughts, but you're then just holding that space and that pause. And so, yeah, I really started to become consciously aware of that. But even as I deepened on my spiritual journey, kind of tying this into this conversation around sisterhood, I didn't have people in my life who were also interested in this level of growth. And I worked at a TGI Fridays, and all of the people there wanted to go out and get drunk and talk about it the next day. And I spent time with those people, one, because we were in proximity on a regular basis, so it's kind of inescapable to some degree. But I would hang out with them on the weekends and after work. They were my college friends. But I always felt very othered. I felt very unsafe around them, unappreciated. And it's funny, I don't know if you're into human design, but I'm a projector. And, as a projector, it's very important to not offer yourself and not be in spaces where you're not seen and you're not respected and you're not valued. And so learning that about myself, I'm like, oh my God, my whole life makes so much sense. If I only knew this as a kid, I would have really removed myself from so many situations. But, that was challenging in the beginning to really feel like I needed to choose between being around people and having connection or being by myself. because I, really didn't have any sense of community. There was one guy who worked at Fridays, poor guy Richie, and he was the only person I knew who had read anything about personal development. He used to make so much money. He had read one of the like Napoleon Hill books, or a couple of them. And those were like his Bible. And I would legit follow him around from table to table because it was like, oh my God, I finally found somebody who can like match my energy and excitement around this. And they'd be like, Jen, I really this is a great conversation, but I really got to go to my tables. And yeah, I was just like really craving that dialogue. And I mean, thankfully I had like audiobooks and things like that, but like that became my social interaction. It was like, okay, you're whoever the three people you spend the most time with. So I just drowned myself in like content from, people who I aspired to be like, and just kind of isolated myself in ways and sort of just became really careful about who I gave my energy to for like a little bit. And then I slowly started to like find people who were more like-minded. But it's funny to look back now because I have such a strong community and I almost forget, and I'll get messages from people like, oh, how do you find sisterhood? How do you find your mastermind buddies? And I'm like, oh yeah, like that is a really awkward and sometimes lonely journey in the beginning.
And that's what I was gonna bring up and highlight is like I feel like so many people listening to this could relate to that, where it's like when you awaken to your spiritual path and you have those first awakenings, you can start feeling not only disassociated, which I want to touch on with you, but also very alone. Like you can't really relate to other people, or the people won't understand you, or you might feel like it's very like woo woo and weird to talk about these things. And it can bring forth loneliness for those that aren't accustomed to solitude. And I think it is very common for people who are first awakening, especially if you're not surrounded by people who are already on that journey and understand what it is that you're going through, for it to just feel incredibly uncomfortable and for you to be divinely sent into solitude, which I can relate to. So I want to ask, like, speaking on the disassociation, especially for you, since your path began with you realizing that you are not your thoughts, you are like the observer of your thoughts. I feel like that first realization can kind of drive you crazy, because like then you're like hearing yourself think and you're like, oh my gosh, like I'm not these thoughts, and like you're like overthinking it. Did you experience that kind of disassociation, or like how was that navigation for you and like actually finding your footing in the spiritual journey?
Yeah, it is kind of an awkward thing as you're first beginning to basically prune old neural pathways of these old thought patterns and strengthen and rebuild and rehearse these new, more aligned belief systems. And I actually have one really specific memory. I was going out for a run. This was probably still, or this was in the early days of like the iPods, like iPod Nano situation, where I got a CD audio program in the mail, burned it onto my computer, and then pulled it into my iPod Nano. And I went for a run, and it was the first time that I had ever done that with actual personal development instead of music. And I remember coming home and feeling like so much of my life changed, because it was the first time that I had someone else's positive voice for an entire hour, basically reprogramming me. And in that moment, it's wild to look back on, because you never know. Like I didn't think in that moment that that was going to be this transformational, pivotal light bulb for me. It was just kind of like, oh, that's interesting. But in that moment, I realized that it was the first time in a very long time that I didn't have that broken record playing. And so again, I was able to separate out, that's not my voice, and that's not the voice that I want playing. And so that was really, one of those times where I began to bring that in. But yeah, I mean, it's funny because over the years, I've been in so many different Facebook groups and different communities and run so many programs. And especially when people are in the early days of learning about manifestation, I experienced this as well, where it's like, oh my God, I had a negative thought. Now I'm in a full spiral panic. In the early days, I was learning about Abraham Hicks. In 2014, still kind of looking for community. I ended up I was a fitness instructor and had like, this amazing fitness community. And I ended up falling during a race and breaking my ankle real bad, busting this thing was like a melon. So I was in a cast and on crutches for a while and kind of like isolated in my home. And I was like, I was talking to my mom. She's like, why don't you go to a meetup.com? I was like, Mom, that's for old people. And then like, I'm like in the early 20s. I'm like, not, or however old I was like, I'm not going to meetup.com. And she's like, well, she's a therapist. She's like, I have some clients that have had a lot of success with it. And I'm rolling my eyes. And then finally, I just got to the point where I was like kind of desperate. So I went to this law of attraction meetup group. I was the youngest person there by, God, I don't know, 20 years, and ended up really finding like-minded people who were also sort of like exploring those things. So I think, that was another, like looking back, another chapter that opened up for me where I started having somebody who I could talk to and dialogue with. And we would meet every single week at Panera. They had this like private back room, and there would be guest speakers who would come in and talk about manifestation. And we would do Abraham Hicks audio meditations together. And somebody came in and did a crystal workshop. And I'm like, what are crystals? Like, it was all so new to me, but that really allowed me to kind of explore my own thoughts and opinions on what all of this like world of spirituality was. And all of this time I was, growing my online business, and in no world did I ever think that I would be having conversations with people around spirituality, and, certainly not teaching any aspects of it at that time.
Yeah. And what I'm getting from this is like, one, like when you first start coming into your spiritual journey, like you're going to find yourself like craving more content, like more spiritual content, teachers, guides, books, audio, to like really nourish that newfound student that you've
Mm-hmm.
aligned to. And secondly, it's so important that if you do find yourself feeling lonely or alone on the journey, to put yourself out there and to gift yourself the opportunity to meet new people, starting like with the
Yeah.
things that interest you. And it can feel awkward, but if we don't try to put ourselves out there to meet these new people, to meet our soul family, to meet the new reflections of ourselves, then, you know, you got to give yourself that opportunity. You got to
Yes.
allow yourself to try and put yourself out there.
Absolutely. It's interesting because even today, like recently in the last couple of months, there's a beautiful yoga studio that opened up just a few months ago by my house, and somebody facilitated a cacao ceremony, and we all came together. And, I live in New York City, and it was like, oh my God, there is a community here. And all of us were saying, I've been craving community. I've been waiting a bit. And obviously, with being in New York over the last 2 years, it's been a little bit more hardcore with, everybody kind of being separated and whatnot. So, I mean, that desire is even greater, I would say, for people in New York than probably most other places. And, to finally have this place, it's just incredible to me to see like how deep that desire is to connect and to be seen and to be able to, be supported on this journey. And so if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I don't have a community, it's like, build it. Like, you can also bring that call out there. There's so many Facebook groups. There's just so many people who want to connect. And like, that's been such a beautiful lesson for me, just learning that again, in the last couple of months.
Something that you brought up earlier was about you changing your voice into a voice that you actually like. And I want to touch on that because just us talking about, you realizing that you are not the voice in your head. And that can be kind of a hard concept to grasp at first because we are so identified with the voice in our head. We think it's natural. It's just a voice that's speaking in there, but we never actually sit down to ask ourselves, well, like I can actually listen to this without me
Mm-hmm.
speaking, like what, just questioning yourself. And no one taught us, but realizing that you have the power to shift that voice, to decide how that voice impacts you. And you saying and you sharing with us that you consciously chose to change that voice, I'm curious to ask you, like, what did you change that voice from? Like, what was that voice originally that you didn't enjoy? And what did you shift it into?
oh man, my inner voice was so mean. I even have journal entries. I used to journal a lot, and it would be like, you're fat, lose weight, you suck. Like I was like so rude to myself, like the disrespect. So like, of course I allowed that same level of disrespect in the relationships I had, because it was just a mirror of how I felt about myself inside. And so I began to, really change that voice by challenging the things that I was saying. Like, is that true? Do I want that to be true? And I started learning, from different law of attraction teachers. I would say something or think something, and then in my head I'd go cancel, clear, delete. Like, I forget I don't remember what teacher came up with that, but it's like just an easy, quick way. You're like, oh, I'm like, I don't have any money for that. Ooh, cancel, clear, delete. I'm choosing not to make that investment yet. Like just changing the way that I use language. And, along my journey, I really started learning so much more about the coaching world, and really just tying everything in with my psychology degree and NLP, which is neuro linguistic programming, which is really so much about really understanding the way in which we use language and the way in which language influences the way that we feel. Like when we say something, how does that resonate? What are the sensations in your body? What are the feelings that come up? What are the pictures that appear in your mind, which are called internal representations? And how do those pictures resonate for you? And what are those subconscious things when we bring them into our conscious awareness? Like, is that actually what you want to be manifesting and creating and focusing on? Or is that something that is actually feeling misaligned and dissonant and creating that resistance and actually moving towards what you desire? So all of that was all deeply connected, and really more deeply not only recognizing and having that awareness, but actually having the tools to rewrite those stories.
I love that spiritual practice, or that like conscious awareness practice that you shared, of like taking that moment to really listen to words, listen to language, and ask yourself, how does this make me feel? Do I enjoy how this makes me feel? And you sharing with us that like the voice that you had was unkind. What first came up for me was like, a lot of the times we don't realize that that voice that has overpowered us, that we identify with, isn't really even our voice. Like the unkind words that you were telling yourself, that wasn't your true self telling yourself that. That was society and, the upbringing, your environment, like all of these external voices that were conditioned in your mindset, that were programmed within you, that were unkind to you. Because I think it's just so important for us to like really know that our true self will not be unkind to us.
Yeah.
So if there's like an unkind voice, a voice in your head that isn't loving to you, that's not your true voice.
Mm-hmm.
That's a conditioning.
Absolutely. That is not your higher self. And I learned from Abraham Hicks, kind of what you're talking about with like feeling into it. They talk about the emotional guidance system, which was a beautiful, extremely beautiful tool for me. I'm a very systematic person. I like being able to take, especially something as mystical and, wide in terms of what we could do in terms of manifestation. And it gave me a system and a way to understand something that was a little bit less tangible. And if you Google it, you'll see that they have sort of ordered certain words. So depression is at the bottom and anger is above that. And it's like contentment. And then, all the way up to like all these levels of bliss and joy. And it can be very challenging when people are first learning about this and they're saying, I don't know how to keep track of all of my thoughts. Oh my gosh, what if I have a negative thought? I'm going to ruin everything. And that could be really hard because like, yeah, you're thinking over 60,000 thoughts per day, the average person. And most people, like Joe Dispenza talks about this, 92% of the thoughts that you 92% of the thoughts that you think today are the same thoughts that you thought yesterday. 92%. And so when people are like, oh, why can't I change? Like, it's understandable why so many people keep living out the same patterns, because they don't have the understanding, the tools, and just the compassion for themselves to say like, okay, like this this is something that I'm going to intentionally work on. And, rebuilding new neural pathways is like building a muscle in the gym. Some people walk in, they're like, oh, I want to bench press the biggest weights that we've got. Okay, you could try, but if you have not ever done that before, you might not get it up in the air, and that's okay. Like, you can begin with baby steps. And that was hard for me because I have a competitive side, and I like to do in the beginning, it's like, I want to do it right. I wanted to have control over everything. And, I was just very humbled by the journey of really being intentional. And it's amazing really now to look back on this journey of 10 plus years and really see the growth that's happened, because at the time it felt like nothing was happening. It felt like nothing was moving. And I remember reading The Compound Effect probably in like 2011 or 2012. And they gave this beautiful chart of, how compounding interest happens. And I just remember always reminding myself over those first couple of years, the growth is happening, even if you can't see it. You can't see it because you are in it, but it is happening. And just really having like a visual aid. I really like visual aids, very visual learner. Having that to kind of support me was a beautiful reminder, to not kind of throw it all away and say, oh, nothing's working. Just a nice way to acknowledge myself. But yeah, so that's really where like the rewriting of the reprogramming started. But today, like I have a very different perspective, or a much more layered perspective on the thoughts in our head, where, I do have certain gifts of mediumship and do have, spirits that will come through. And now I'm like, oh, I'm not taking shit that comes in my mind as fact. Like I am questioning everything. For many, many months over the last couple of years, I didn't know at the time, but I would have all these really like very dark images coming through right before bed, where it was like really weird. And so it was like actually hard to fall asleep. I'd smoke weed. I'm like, what the hell is this? I don't know what's wrong. And it wasn't until like maybe 2 years ago that I realized like, oh, these are freaking sketchers. These are like spirits. And I, worked a little bit with Shaman Durek and really learned how to actually like dialogue with them and send them to the light, because they will attach to different people at different points in their life and just be like, hey, voice in my head that said, you're a piece of shit. Why would you say that to me? And they're like, oh, because I want to scare you. And I'm like, okay, do you need help going home? They're like, yeah. Or sometimes they'll be like, no, I don't need help. And I'm like, oh, well, why are you afraid to go to the light? They're like, oh, because I don't. And they'll like kind of beat it around the bush. And you're like, don't you want to be with your mom? Do you want to be with your friends? Don't you want to like be with the light? And like, eventually, I've learned to have those conversations with them and feel when they've actually cleared. Because it's just like, you just feel a different frequency. But that has been a tool that has literally changed my life. Just being able to have a 2-minute dialogue. I've used it with so many clients and they're just like, whoa. And really, I stopped having all of those horrible negative images. Mm-hmm. In the beginning, when I first learned it, I was sending 30 spirits to the light a night for like 2 weeks and then nothing.
Mm-hmm. We're going to get into that. We're going to transition into you discovering your gifts, because that is what comes, I think, post shadow work. Mm-hmm. But I want to touch on a couple of things that you shared. One, the importance of integration and practice, like realizing that just because you became aware of something doesn't mean that you're going to have it integrated or like programmed within you and in your system like right away. You have to practice it. You have to, strengthen it, just like you said, like a muscle. And another thing to know in regards to the example of like strengthening a muscle, strengthening an awareness, is like realizing that practice is a practice of a lifetime. Mm-hmm. Like when you're in the gym and you're like strengthening a muscle, if you like get to the point where you're like, okay, yeah, I'm strong, and then you stop, that muscle is going to weaken over time because you're not continuing to practice, you're not continuing to strengthen. And the other thing that I want to touch on is when, you bringing up this experience of you coming into contact with other spirits, is like something that I realized is when we do start really investing in our spiritual self, we are opening up our channel to the spirit world. And we're going to start having these experiences, and we may not know how to approach them or you know, yeah, we may not know how to approach them at first, but we have to realize, like, okay, this is actually not me. This is a spirit. This is, whatever. So let's expand on that. Talk to us about you coming into your gifts and the various like modalities that you may have explored, because I feel like at first when we are coming into our gifts, it's like some of it we like intuitively feel, others like we feel called to and we give it a try and they're like, oh, actually that's not my thing. So what was
Mm.
that journey for you?
So I've always kind of felt like certain pulsing in my hands when, I would resonate strongly with something, but I didn't think much of it. In terms of channeling, like I said, I was always a big fan of Abraham Hicks, but I never considered that I would also be able to one day channel, not even on my radar. But obviously, I was attracted to it and interested in it and would get full body chills anytime I read any of those books because my soul was like, hello, like, girl, he's right here. Pay attention. So, I mean, I remember the first time something kind of like took over my body. It was a Tony Robbins event. They were doing this inner child thing. It's sort of like the event at the end of 6 days. And so we were all deeply open and doing all this incredible healing work. And it was an inner child healing, and they took us through it. And then it was sort of like this quiet moment. And my neck started just like doing all these weird things. And I wasn't moving my neck, and it freaked me out. My neck started clicking backwards, almost like in my body, it felt and almost sounded like a roller coaster, the way that it goes up right before it drops, like click, click, click. My vertebrae started going backwards. And every time a vertebrae clicked backwards, my throat was closing and I couldn't breathe. And it was getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And I'm like, oh my God, what the fuck's happening? Like, this is such a weird feeling. I'm not doing this. Who's doing this to my neck? Why is this happening? Like, what's going on? And then I got to the very top, and then it was completely closed, and it just went, and my whole throat opened, and I took the deepest breath ever. I thought that was so weird. Didn't really think about it again. About a year and a half later, I sat for the first time with plant medicine, and a friend of mine started just talking and channeling. And we didn't really know what channeling was at the time. And I'm sort of like laying there, kind of going in and out, and I'm looking at her, and different faces are appearing on her face. There was one that kind of looked like a fairy. And this was going on for like 3 hours before I really like put it together. And every time she would kind of change topics, the face would change right before. So there was this face that kept talking about ancient Egypt. There was this female face that was talking about the collective consciousness. And I was like, I think you're channeling right now. So it's like so funny to think back on, because this was so new to me at the time. And she's like, what are you talking about? You're freaking me out. I'm freaking me out. I'm like, no, keep going, keep going. And I'm drawing out the pictures of what I see on her face. It was like a little face floating over her face. Very, very bizarre at the time. And about a year later, or maybe like 8 months later, I sat with ayahuasca for the first time. And I did a whole podcast, like sharing like all the nitty gritty details of that, and really cleared and healed so much in my body and in my womb. And I think that really was a huge catalyst for the next time I sat in a plant medicine ceremony. That was when my energy healing gifts came through, because it was like I finally cleared the frequency of all of these lower vibrations so that this channel could open even more, because what I channel is like a much higher frequency, and my body like was not matched with that frequency, like almost like a radio. It wasn't tuned to that to even allow that in. And so I was in a medicine ceremony. My hands started moving. Kind of thought it was annoying because my hand was moving by itself. And I'm just like, calm down. I'm like trying to take a nap here, just trying to chill. And my hands wouldn't stop going. And eventually I sat up because I couldn't stop it. And then as my arms were moving, at first I thought that I was just, kind of calibrating my body and soul, which was something that had happened in ayahuasca with my feet. And I'm just like, all right, whatever, like it's just doing its thing. It'll probably stop soon. And then I noticed that as my hands were moving in certain ways, taking on different formations, I would fan my hand really quickly all of a sudden, and somebody across the room, their butt starts shaking like Shakira. And then I stop my hand and their butt stops. And then I let my hand go again. and they start moving again. And it's like this little game I'm playing for like 5 minutes going, no, 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 this can't be happening. This can't actually be happening. And then forcing my hand to stop and going back and forth. And I'm like, holy shit, am I doing that? Like, is that me? Am I moving something? And I'm looking at one of my friends, Stephanie, and she's just like smiling and nodding to me, giving me this beautiful, so coming back to sisterhood, just giving me this like support and this permission slip and holding the space for me to like let my arms move however they wanted to. And that night I ended up like moving all of the energy in the room and clearing it. And I say but like it wasn't me. Like my arms were moving in one direction and my head was turned the other way. And I'm having a conversation with a friend going, hey, what time is it? And she's like, oh my God, Jen, your hands are like still going. And I'm like, I'm not moving my arms, guys. I don't know what I'm channeling. And she's like, you looked like a blue alien. So that was like one of the most, and will probably forever be the most transformational, like wild experience of my entire life. And I remember us sitting there integrating afterwards, and I didn't even know how to put words to it. Woke up the next day. I was like, was that real? This was like a sci-fi moment. Like, what the hell is going on? I mean, the level of cognitive dissonance of, your reality kind of being cracked open. And then, of course, my arms were unbelievably sore because I was fanning my hands around for, 5-6 hours straight and they wouldn't stop. And, that was really the beginning of things opening. And I'm sitting there going, is this something I can do now? Was this just a one-time thing? Can I channel this all the time? And not even a few days later, I was facilitating an in-person experience. And I ended up not on any medicine, helping one of my clients clear out major trauma from her body. We just kind of impromptu last minute, kind of at the end of the night, she had opened a lot of her body during a breathwork experience that someone else had come in to facilitate. And I was like, all right, I want to help you ground back into your body. I don't want to send you home like this. Like, let's, get present to what's going on. And we ended up, my new energy gifts activated. We spent an hour and a half. She's like moaning, like she's giving birth. And her and I sat outside and integrated afterwards. And she was like, I had 3 vignettes of things that I witnessed where she's like, I saw myself being conceived and it was like kind of dark and messed up. She's like, holy crap, I didn't know that. Saw herself being birthed and her mother trying to hold her in because of like circumstances surrounding that. And then also witnessed herself giving birth to one of her kids and feeling how beautiful and expansive that was and how her mom maybe didn't really have that level of an experience. Next morning, she's like, oh my God, Jen, I feel completely different in my body. My center of gravity is completely different. And then when she went home, she had her very first orgasm with a partner that she had ever had in her entire life. So I'm sitting there like, what the literal F like what just happened? Because this is like so bizarre, so out there, so not in. And I'm sitting there going, I need the scientific explanation. I need to understand this. I'm Googling and YouTubing, trying to make sense of this for my brain because I can't believe that it's real. And I think, she was just a divine gift for me. And it was absolutely meant to be because I was like right before everything shut down with COVID. And I needed to have that experience to confirm for myself that like, yes, girl, you can do this. And it's pretty freaking cool. And you need to continue doing this and you need to explore this. And just to like have that secondary validation. Like, I don't know if how that would have evolved had I not had that very clear defining moment in that study.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
It is wild.
It is so wild and it's so deep. Like it's so deep and I love hearing these experiences of just like really realizing how interconnected our mind, body, spirit is.
Mm-hmm.
It's so interconnected. And I think an important takeaway from what you shared with us is the importance of letting go, the importance of making space, the importance of cleansing yourself to actually be able to come into your gifts because you need that cleansing. You need to continuously be opening up your channel to be tuning into that higher vibration and into your true self. And I'd like to ask you, what has been the most challenging clearing for you that you've experienced, or a letting go that was necessary for you to really continue embodying your higher self?
Mm. So it's interesting because I think when it first awakened, I was very cautious about who I told. I was very uncomfortable. It took me 2 years to integrate and really like even start talking about it on podcasts. And I only did like a full episode sharing like a lot of what I'm talking about today, like 3 months ago. And I was, teaching it and embodying it in so many ways, but I wasn't quite ready to put it out there publicly. And I had worked with a shaman. Some people might know Shaman Derek, had a one-on-one call with him. And he was like, Spirit's telling me that you are like basically, I forget, I'm paraphrasing, but not allowing yourself to be fully seen, and you're allowing some people to see this part of you, and you're like, oh, there's this part and then there's this part, and like these people are privy to this. And so I was like, shit, yeah, I'm totally doing totally doing that. Like, yeah, for my high level clients, we're all open, we're talking about all these crazy things, sending spirits of the light. And then, with my broader community, I'm not really integrating those conversations. And I think allowing myself the space to just have a deeper understanding of that was really powerful. And then also like having deeper clearings around things that like to this day I'm like, is that even real? But it's like however the body, however the subconscious mind is holding on to it, however it's creating resistance is right. So something that Shaman Durek helped me integrate, this is such a random like side tangent, but he was helping me understand like what these healing gifts are. And he said, do you have any birthmarks? I said, oh yeah, I have like I was like, he's like, not like a mole, like a birthmark. I'm like, oh yeah, I have like a coffee stain one. And he's like, where? I was like, my back. He's like, where on your back? My lower back. And he's like, oh, okay, this all makes sense. I'm like, wait, what does this mean? And apparently our birthmarks are a sign of our healing gifts from past lives being brought into this lifetime. And so whenever I tell those people are like, wait, I have one here. What does this mean? I'm like, I don't know. Go message Shaman Durek, tell him to do a podcast on birthmarks. Okay. I don't know. He only told me what mine was, but he had me activate my birthmark. And I'm like, okay. So it's like, activate my birthmark, help me remember. And all of a sudden I felt this overwhelming well of sadness. And I started uncontrollably sobbing. And he's like, what are you feeling? I said, I'm feeling sadness. And help me basically. And he wasn't giving me any answers. He's just like having me ask questions. And I saw all of the like this crowd of people around me. And I was actually killed and strangled for speaking about these spiritual truths in a past lifetime where I had these same gifts. And it's funny because like, even if I say this now, I'm like, this sounds so out there. Like I'm still integrating some of this stuff to a degree. Right. But as soon as I processed that and healed that and cleared that and accepted that, all of a sudden I was like, okay, I'm ready to talk about this now. Because there was this deep fear of literally dying and being ostracized. And it wasn't just like a rejected, it was like much deeper than that. But literally after that session with him and releasing that and activating my birthmark and all that whole experience, that was when I had this deep readiness to speak about this and share about it and bring it into my offerings more publicly. And yeah, you just like all of this stuff. It's like in the early days, I was, going to school for psychology. My mom's a therapist, and it was like, oh, therapy's the best. And now I'm like, yo, there's so many more layers. There's
Yeah.
so many more layers.
Yeah, I was gonna say like sometimes our fears are rooted in like past lifetimes that we're not even aware of. I have a friend who's a water healer, and we were having a conversation, and I don't remember exactly what we were expanding on, but I'll never forget when she showed those of us who were there like these marks on her neck that were like they looked like wrinkles, but they were like just very like all around her neck and like just very visible. And she was sharing with us how she had been, strangled in past lifetimes for, speaking on these topics and for being a healer. And it just makes you think like how far we've come, like spirituality and wellness and all of these things are more and more becoming, on the surface and mainstream and popular. But like, I think it's so important for us to really acknowledge how there was a time where healers were, killed for speaking on these things, and it was very dangerous. And so there's like an honor to having the safety to speak on these things. So yes, thank you for sharing that with us. And yeah, tying that back to, you realizing, why it is that you were kind of holding yourself back on like speaking certain things, and like now you're receiving that clarity is like, okay. And I'm sure you're now like affirming that safety to yourself, like I can speak on these things, like,
Yeah. And it's like now I feel so comfortable like sharing videos of me channeling or singing. And I, had a past career as a performer and vocalist. But back then it was all about the performance and doing it right and hitting the right notes. And through my spiritual journey, that's transformed of this like vocal alchemy and really recognizing that it's about whatever you're verbalizing and bringing forth, that it's an offering. It's not a performance. It's a divine offering. And so, everything around getting strangled was so connected back to that as well, of like self-expression and allowing light language and all of these things to come through more easily, more effortlessly, and also feeling safe within myself and my energy and my own body to actually be able to share those more easily and allow the messages to come through.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm happy for you. I'm
Thank
glad that
you.
you've been experiencing this opening in many different ways, and continuously really coming into your voice and the power of your voice. Let's get into how this spiritual journey, which I'm sure there's so much more, impacted your career. Because I think so many people, when they do come into their spiritual awakening, they feel this tug and pull, if you will, of like their career, like their professional life and their spiritual life. And like, how do I navigate this? Like, I don't resonate with my profession anymore. Like, how did your spiritual journey impact your profession and your career?
I love this question. So I think I'm currently in that transition where I previously really focused very heavily on business strategy, which I love. I still love all of that. And feel like I channel so much when I'm supporting my clients in that area. So I think some people are like, oh, if you're spiritual, you wear dresses and have flowy hair and, this like over the top divine feminine goddess. And it's like, for me, that's not how it needs to be expressed. I just see like my business offerings more now as channeled offerings with a lot of like still a lot of supportive masculine energy strategy in that. Like, I think some, like I said, people go, it has to be one or the other. So really integrating that more deeply in. And then also like really right now I'm in this transition of, I recently had a beautiful conversation with Allison Bird, and she was talking about her own transitions, and she used the word graduate. That as she sort of evolved her offerings, that she's like, seeing different people who were teaching sales, she's like, that gave me the permission to graduate from teaching those things and then move on to the next. And I was like, oh my God, that is the best word. People always say permission to pivot or, go into the next level of expansion. But there was something that resonated with me about the word graduate and this was like last week where I was like, oh my God, I'm having like an awakening moment, this huge breakthrough just around the way that I was framing and seeing the completion of that chapter in a way that was really honoring it without sort of leaving it behind. It's like, okay, I can still talk about those things. I can still teach it, but I've graduated from that previous version of my purpose and my education and my whatever. And now it's time to kind of go into this like PhD level of whatever it is that I'm talking about. And that's evolving. So yeah, I think it's a really tricky thing to navigate because I've experienced it myself and witnessed it with a lot of my sisters who have, also evolved spiritually. And yeah, there's been a lot of us that have come to points in time where it's like, oh my God, everything within a year, it's like, oh my gosh, my old offerings don't resonate at all. Like, who was the version of me that created that? I want to burn it all to the ground. I don't want to talk about any of that anymore. Or like, oh my gosh, the way that I spoke to that was so clueless. Like when you're growing very intentionally and really putting that forth and really being in the integration and the practice and the immersion, it can be a little bit challenging because you're growing so fast and things are changing in your life and the way that you want to be supported, the way that you communicate, so many things around you start to feel the contrast of what's misaligned amplify as you grow quickly. I was just talking to a friend, Stephanie, about this and, how challenging it is sometimes with food. And oh my God, I like really can't eat those things like alcohol, can't do coffee. Like my body is just in such a different frequency and it's so much more open and so much more sensitive that to stay in this frequency that has now become my normal, I really have to be more in integrity with what I'm bringing into my body, what I'm bringing into my energetic field, what I'm allowing myself to consume. And yeah, there can be some bigger life changes that happen within that. And it can be a little frustrating. It could be a little challenging, but eventually it's, I think we all kind of figure out what is right for us.
Mm-hmm. I love that perspective of graduating.
Mm-hmm.
I can relate to that so much because I feel like I've really been in this transitional state of like, I resonate with that concept of like, I graduated from this because I intuitively feel like I have completed a cycle. And that's how I have been perceiving what I'm experiencing because I experienced a lot of success in a past version of me that has been dying, if you will, I guess. Or I don't know how to word
the
that
shamanic
yet.
ego death, like
yeah. And like it's been a process of like really coming to terms of letting that go because it's like, oh man, like is that version of me like really over? And just realizing like how there's all these experiences that have been coming to play that have been making me more and more realize like, yes, like that cycle, that mission, that purpose has been completed. And that can bring forth grief, but it's also something to be incredibly proud of. And you will feel it intuitively. Like it's time to pursue the next mission in this life. So I love that perspective of like, I graduated.
You're like, I'm not trying to do 10th grade for the third time. Like we've moved on.
Yeah. It's kind of like that of what you just said. It's kind of that saying that says like, you're not starting over from scratch. You're like starting over with experience.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And like that one word that you graduate, I feel like that when she said it the other day gave me so much context to exactly that concept. If you're not starting over, you bring all of that with you. And I'm like, well, when somebody graduates and moves on to, their master's or their PhD or whatever, it's like, of course you can't get into those programs unless you have everything previously that's coming with you. So yeah, just wow, what a beautiful perspective.
Yeah. There's a couple last things that I want to touch on. One, you becoming a successful 7-figure business. I feel called to ask you, like, was there a healing that needed to be done for you in regards to any thoughts, mentality rooted in lack, scarcity, just like an unhealthy relationship with money? Did you experience that or work through that?
Absolutely. I have gone through so much money mindset work. It is quite interesting to see how that has continued to evolve over the last couple of years. And, growing up, it was kind of like, grew up in it was like the lower middle class kid in the super duper rich neighborhood where we just sort of like accidentally ended up in this particular like zone of schooling where everybody had a nanny and a mansion. And it was like, who made your lunch, your mom or your nanny? That was a normal question, which we moved when I was in second grade because my parents were like, we got to get them out of here. These kids, what's going on? And so it was very interesting to hear like that from my parents. Like, we have to get them out of here. Like, these kids with nannies, they're disrespectful to their parents. And oh, look at these moms in their tennis outfits coming to pick up their kids and think they're like hot. Like, and my dad owned a construction business and worked in the Hamptons in these like gazillion dollar, billionaire homes. And I remember even like going with him as a kid and being like, oh my God, they have 15 bathrooms. Like, this is so strange, because we lived in a second story of a 2-family house and I shared a bedroom with my brother until second grade. So like, at the time, I think we moved just before we really started imprinting meaning, like deeper meaning around like we are other, but it was slowly starting to happen. And then of course, hearing all my parents growing up and how they reflected on like, oh, that town was, all their negative thoughts that they felt on it. So I had a lot of things that I needed to shift around. Oh, rich people are greedy. Rich people don't take care of their children. They have kids that are brats, and on and on and on and on. So there was definitely a lot of reprogramming to do there, and just, getting comfortable with the idea of abundance. We never needed for anything, but my mom was a ninja at always getting 0% credit cards so that she could move the debt around without collecting interest, which like, kudos to my mom, because she, my brother and I, when we graduated college or even high school, started getting all these credit card companies reaching out, trying to get business. Oh, we'll give you 0%. So she would sign up with us. She built our credit, but she was like banking on like us getting these 0% because she wasn't getting them in the mail. Sign up with us. So it's like genius idea. But even that, you know what I mean? That was even something that needed to be done to move the debt around. And she did a good job keeping track of all of that. But just the idea that like, there's just enough, or like, we're just at that place where we can figure it out. We're not panicking, we're managing it, but there's not overflow. So getting used to the idea of overflow was really uncomfortable. And when I started making like really great money, it happened very quickly. I had a business partner at the time, and we just exploded. And literally this was in like 2016-ish when we joined forces, within a year and a half, we were pacing $1 million business. And we parted ways, just before this like last launch that was going to really put us over that mark. But like, that was an incredible amount of money to come into very quickly. And I didn't know how to manage it. I'm like, what do I invest in? Where do I put this money? How do I, save? What should I save? What should I spend? Like, I had never had that much abundance that quickly. And it was a little bit overwhelming. And I had to let go and reprogram a lot of beliefs that I wasn't good at managing money, that I didn't deserve it. And I found myself wanting to find ways to give it away. So I was like, well, I got to give money to my parents, and like, they should pay off their mortgage. So I'm going to give them a bunch of money, because like, that makes sense to my brain, because then they will pay interest. So like, that's a good use for this money. But I wasn't thinking like, hey, you work for yourself, you should create an investment portfolio. Nobody taught me that. It didn't occur to me. So yeah, long story longer, I had a lot of different ways that I needed to sort of reprogram the different ways that I thought about money, and really allowing myself to receive that money and hold that money and grow that money, and not just try to recirculate it immediately.
Allowing is like the key word, I feel. And sometimes I feel like people will listen to something like that and be like, well, of course I allow myself to have a lot of money. Like, it's not like I'm not allowing myself, but it really is a lot of subconscious work in regards to that.
Mm-hmm. And then also like, when you're making more, you're probably investing more, and you might have people that you're bringing on as like full-time team members, and you're looking at like, oh my God, that's what I spent this month. But also, okay, this is what we made this month, and just really getting used to seeing bigger numbers, like getting used to depositing a $10,000 check and having that be normal. That was very weird for me. For many years, it was like I only had a few $1,000s in the bank account and I felt wealthy,
Yeah.
like just recalibrating to these different standards, I think was an interesting emotional, mental stretch.
Yeah. The last thing that I want to talk about is sisterhood. Sisterhood, as I mentioned, early on in our conversation is something that has been on my mind a lot, especially in the past couple of years as I've been awakening my femininity. I hadn't realized that I had suppressed my feminine. And for a long time, I was very aware that I had a lot of healing to do surrounding masculinity. But it wasn't until recently that I really realized, like, actually, I have a lot of healing to do surrounding femininity and my relationship with women and, all of that. And I'd like to ask you, since it's something that you brought up as well, like, what was that journey for you in coming into sisterhood? You mentioned you didn't have sisterhood. So, what healing did you have to do to align with the sisterhood you have now?
Hmm. So I think it really began with a little bit at a time raising my standards around who I wanted to allow into my life. I mean, in the early days, it was anybody who would give me, their attention and say like, you're my friend. I'm like, okay, great. Like, I got made fun of a lot as a kid. So I really had a very low sense of worth. I do think a big catalyst for me was my childhood best friend, not a very good friend. She wrote me a letter in 2014, basically like right before she moved. She was like, here's this letter. And she detailed all of the things that she intentionally did that I always believed she did, but didn't have any proof. It was like, yeah, I purposely excluded you because I wanted to make myself feel better. And just like listed out all of the horrible, fucked up shit she did to me my whole life because we lived down the block from each other. And I was like, I didn't know quite how to process that. And I thought that was really messed up that she just gave me this letter and then was like, okay, bye, I'm moving across the country. And we still have not really unpacked it to this day. That's definitely on my list of things to have a nice little sit down at some point. But I think for me, that actually was very healing in many ways because it was the validation that like, you're not crazy and stop putting up with bullshit like this. So yeah, that was a big catalyst. And then from there, being in different business environments, I was really at an early stage of my own personal development. And the more that I healed, the more that I started attracting people who matched my frequency. And it's interesting when I look back at all of the different women who were in my life at different stages, the relationships began getting healthier and more equal in that they equally held space for me and my process and equally supported me, because in the beginning it was very imbalanced. And yeah, in the last couple of years, especially, I've finally found those women who, one, had the same vision or similar vision for life and a similar hunger and desire for growth, and who are invested in open communication. So one of my very good friends, Lauren, who has been like my mastermind business bestie since 2015. We actually met randomly in 2007 on a New York City subway and reconnected years later. But with her, we both had all these triggers and traumas from mean girls and being ostracized and talked about when we were younger. And so we're very open about what those things are and very aware when when we trigger each other or when the other person's being triggered. And I think, we've gone through some very difficult times in our friendship where we had some like really big disagreements, but what we've been able to accomplish and work through is that at the end of the day, she's like a full-on sister. It's like, I'm not going anywhere. Like, you could do some crazy shit. You could be like the biggest a-hole and like, I'm going to be annoyed with you, but like, I'm not going anywhere. Like, more recently it was like, oh, you're upset with me. I don't like that you're upset with me. And I was like, but I am frustrated with you. So like, can I just be frustrated with you? She's like, I know, but I don't like it. I'm like, all right, so sit with that. So we just have this very like playful kind of conversation and open communication now around, that we do have different styles and modalities of life, and we can be different people. But at the end of the day, we've built that trust through many disagreements and arguments and falling outs and you upset me and this and that, to know that we've built that trust that we're not going anywhere, that we're not going to abandon each other in any way. And that it's like, you're my ride or die. So, in the past, I did not have that with other women. It was like, oh, I don't agree with that. So like, now you're dead to me and I'm going to talk about you on the internet. or I'm going to gossip about you. And that's not how I roll. It's like we have direct communication. We talk our feelings out. I grew up with that since I was a little kid. My mom putting me and my brother in the room, talk through your feelings. So to now have people who could like actually match that, and also who equally have the same coaching tools to have that dialogue from a almost clinical perspective, it's a really beautiful thing to be able to have such conscious people in my life.
Shout out to those people that truly are safe spaces. And in regards to us speaking on sisterhood, like shout out to the other women who we can be our full, open, honest, unhealed, healing selves with, because it really propels and nurtures the growth and the healing.
100%.
Yeah. Well, I very much enjoyed this conversation, and I want to hold space for you if you feel like there's anything that you'd like to share before we close.
Oh, like any last thoughts? Yeah, I would just say if there's anything in your life right now that is not bringing you some levels of joy, I realize not everything is going to be easy, but if it's not bringing you joy, or there's people in your life that are not bringing you joy, really give yourself the space to journal and reflect on what isn't working for you, because you get to raise your standards, and whatever you have in your life right now, whether it's you're like, oh, I can't hit that 10K month, or I don't have sisterhood. The only reason that you don't have it yet is because all of the past thoughts that are influencing your behavior and the vibration that you're holding, it is all a standard. And you get to choose again today, and you can choose to change that and raise your standards and actually call that in. So,
Amen. Thank you so much. And I do a final five that I just started incorporating.
cool.
So it's just a quick last fill in the sentence, fill in the blank. And it could be a word or more than a word. Ready? Okay. I am grateful to be
alive.
I am grateful to overcome
Challenges.
I am grateful to feel
beautiful.
I'm grateful to understand
that we are human beings living on a planet with infinite potential when we recognize that we can connect into higher consciousness.
Beautiful. And I am grateful to embody
all of the gifts and all of the beings that come through to bring forth healing.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Jen Casey. I appreciate you. And for everyone listening, go check out her podcast, Psyche Pod. It is really good, beautiful conversations that are similar to this. And I'm glad we connected.
Same. You're such an amazing interviewer. This was such a beautiful conversation, and you hold such a beautiful space. I feel like you talked about so many things today that I've never talked about before. So I'm like, okay, this is interesting. I really love where we got to like explore some really fun stuff. So thank you.